everyone to another episode of the Practical Planner podcast. I'm your co-host Thomas Kopelman here with Ann Rhodes and a very special guest, Chris Nason. I'm going to let Ann intro Chris because she knows him pretty well. But really, before we get into it, we're having him join us for two main episodes. The first one is really just thinking through the exemption being cut in half in 2026 and things that we should do to plan around it. And then second, we're going to talk a little bit about slats, which I think go hand in hand. I mean, for me and my clients and most estate planners I talk to, it's one of the first strategies to consider. So that's why we brought Chris on. But Ann, I'm going to hand this off to you to do a quick little intro.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. So these two episodes are really special for me. I have worked with Chris at McDermott. You know, we are personal friends, and so it's really with great pleasure that we are having you on our podcast today, Chris. Just to introduce Chris to our audience, Chris is a partner at McDermott, Will and Emery in the private client group based out of their San Francisco office and teaches estate planning at Stanford Law School. I could go on and on about his academic and professional achievements. A couple just to note is that he was named one of the best lawyers once to watch in America, Trust and Estate section, in the past 4 years. He also is the managing editor of the preeminent legal treatise on cross-border estate planning, which is called International Estate Planning. So I can't stress enough how lucky we are to have you, Chris, today to share your ample expertise and knowledge and trust and estates with us. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Anna. I'm certainly happy to be here.
So I know that we have had, for our audience members, you have probably heard of variety of or variation on this topic of what happens because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will be certain of the laws that were enacted will automatically sunset in 2025 to 2026, right? The stroke of midnight on December 31st. And so one of those that impacts estate planning in particular is the doubling of the federal gift and estate tax exemption, as well as the general generation skipping transfer tax exemption. And so those will go back down to what the levels were before 2017, before this law was enacted. And so I'm sure that you've heard various interpretations of this. And today we have Chris talking on the Practical Planner about the same topic. But in any event, Chris, what are your thoughts? Do you want to give a little bit of background about how this doubling of the exemption works and what it might mean for the clients who are looking at potentially using this doubled exemption?
Just make sure that everybody's on the same page. As you know, there's a 40% federal estate tax that applies at your death. And so if you die with, say, $100,000, you would ordinarily pay estate tax of $40,000, 40% of that amount. However, there is an exemption amount equal to an inflation-adjusted $10 million, which is equal to the amount of gifts you've made during your life plus assets you have at death. So if you die with $20 million, having never made any gifts, the amount today is currently $13.61 million. So you'd pay the 40% on your remaining $6 million that exceeds the exemption amount. If you had given away all of that $13 million during your life, then you'd have no exemption amount left, and you'd pay the 40% tax on the $20 million. And so I said this was an inflation-adjusted $10 million. Prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it was an inflation-adjusted $5 million, and it's scheduled to decrease to an inflation-adjusted $5 million come 2026, which means that right now, for the next year and a half, there's about an extra $7 million that you can give away completely tax-free. And even if the exemption amount goes down, any money that you've given away now is completely outside of your estate. And so it's a great opportunity to make gifts to set up trusts before this amount decreases. Unfortunately, the way this is calculated is that gifts come off the bottom. And so 2026, you'll have about $7 million of exemption. If you've made $6 million worth of gifts, you'll have exactly $1 million worth of exemption remaining. The only way to take advantage of this increased exemption amount is to make gifts exceeding $7 million, which sometimes can be difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously something that really only affects this pretty high net worth crowd. And I really do want to talk about like how we plan for different levels of wealth. And I think age and levels of wealth also play into it. Um, but I'm curious before we even get into there, in the estate planning community, what are the thoughts here? Does everybody think this is for sure going to sunset? Do most people think that this is going to get extended? Is everybody just like, hey, let's be smart and get ahead of this, but who really knows? I'm curious on that side of things.
Sure. So, I mean, this is a bit of political prognostication, right? The way the law is now, it's going to expire. And so it needs Congress to act to extend it. I think if we get a red wave, you may see Congress extending it. If we get a blue wave, or even one blue house or one blue president, probably not. And certainly people I've talked to have suggested that the people who really care about this, the people with significant assets, have already used up this full exemption amount. And so they might not care about extending it further. And so it's sort of the medium rich, the people perhaps with not a ton of political power, who would want to extend it further. And so even in the event that there is a completely red wave, people might not want to use political capital to, give tax cuts to very rich people and rich families. It's not a tremendously politically popular thing. So I think, you can certainly hope that it'll be extended if you're in that situation, but I think it makes sense to do as much as you can by December 31st, 2025, to use as much of the exemption as you possibly can.
Well, so Chris, I think to break it down, and I hope that these sort of categories of investable or wealth that can be transferred makes sense. But would you say then that for the folks who definitely, let's say they fall in the mass affluent up to maybe having wealth that they can transfer up to, let's say, 10 million. What would you tell that client about taking advantage of the doubled exemption? Should they do it at all? Is it, that one spouse should think about doing it, but not the other? Like, what is their, what advice do you have for them first?
Sure. So first, just as a basic matter, because you only get the advantage of this to the extent that you've made gifts exceeding $7 million. If you can't max out both spouses' exemption, a total of $28 million, you should do one spouse first so that when the changes go down, that spouse has a reduced exemption, but the other spouse has the complete exemption, rather than doing half-half, which would cut both the spouses' exemptions. In terms of what you tell someone who has, $10 million, I think the most important thing is to make sure that you're comfortable and you're happy, right? You can certainly back up the bus, give away the full $10 million and plan to live on cat food for the rest of your life, but it's a very difficult and very unpleasant way to live. And so, think about what your financial needs are, think about where your assets are, and then make a plan to give away the excess, but make sure you're comfortable first. And so someone with $10 million in the Bay Area might be different than someone with $10 million in Kansas City. But, give away only what you're comfortable giving away. We'll talk a little bit about slats, I think, in our next show, which gives you sort of a back door to get some of the assets back. But again, make sure you have enough to be comfortable.
Right. And I think this is one of those things where, at least when I was in private practice at Perkins Coie, we also looked at the age of the clients. Because if you're in your 30s, 40s, and you are needing that capital to deploy it, to continue making money, to continue, you have high costs of living because you have children potentially going to college, etc. Just letting this tax tail wag the life dog may not make sense. And on top of that, this exemption amount is a complete political football. Just like you mentioned, Chris, it depends on blue, red houses, presidents, and so all of a sudden, why feel like you're going to use it or lose it when actually that lose it may not happen to you. It may be that in 10, 15 years, another Congress, another administration will be friendly to increasing the exemption again. And so you truly haven't lost an opportunity. There is a sunk cost to having given away all these assets. So you yourself cannot deploy them in the same way again. So that's something to keep in mind too, is the age of your clients. This opportunity might come again for them.
That's absolutely right. And I think age cuts the other way too. If you have someone in their 80s with $10 million, maybe they can give away more. If you have someone in their 40s who's earning a lot of money, they might feel more comfortable giving away more now because they think they'll be able to get more later. But it really depends on family circumstances, cost of living, and expenses and earnings. You're absolutely right.
I think the other variable there too is if you're in your 40s, you might have the mindset of, oh, well, if exemption gets cut in half in 2026, what are the odds that I never have another opportunity later in life to use more exemption because I have 40 to 50 years left to live? And that's why I feel like this stuff gets really hard, because another variable I think is important is what the assets you own are. So like one of the clients I work with, he's about 20 million net worth. They're in their early 40s, but 90% of that's in one private company that you only can sell a couple times a year in a tender offer, and you can't move them into any irrevocable trust because of basically they were told that if they have more entities, they're going to have to go and become a public company. And so for them, we can sit here and talk about, get it cutting in half, your net worth, but because that would be all of the rest of their assets would only be a couple $1 million outside of this private stock. It's like, is that really worthwhile? Because what if this company tanks? Now we moved all of our liquidity out of our estate. And so these discussions become so hard. And then I think the last variable is complexity. I've been seeing tons and tons of people I talk to who are just like, I get it. I don't really want to pay a lot in estate taxes, but I already feel like my financial life is complex. The last thing I want to add is a bunch of irrevocable trust structures.
For those who are willing to live with a little complexity, and here again, categorizations of clients, I want to jump to the sort of the ultra high net worth before we talk about sort of that middle section of folks. So by middle, I mean like 10 million to 28 million or 30 million. But let's say now you have a client who's above the 30 million, like they actually could be taking advantage, and they should have in the previous years, to be honest. Like now is a little, maybe the 11th hour. And we can talk a little bit about what estate planners are seeing out there in practice and if they're even taking in new clients, but that's a separate question. But let's say you have that client who has more than 30 million, in assets they could transfer. What should they have done, or what can they do now?
Sure. I mean, for the people who are lucky enough to have that level of net worth, there's a reasonably simple, well-trodden path, right? And it's, first off, establish a trust in a jurisdiction that doesn't have, what's called the rule against perpetuities. And so a trust that can last essentially forever. In most places, California, New York, Massachusetts, trusts can last about 90 years. In other states, trusts can last an indefinite period of time. And so set up that trust, fund it with, the full 13.61 million, or, next year, 14 million, and apply your GST exemption. Once you've done that, under current law, the trust will be exempt from transfer taxes until the end of time. Right? Any appreciation on that will pay income taxes, but won't pay gift taxes, estate taxes, or GST taxes. If you set that trust up as a grantor trust, you can then pay the income taxes on the income earned by that trust. And so the assets inside of the trust grow completely tax-free. If you still have more money, you can sell assets to the trust. If you seeded it with 14 million, you can sell up to, a total of $140 million worth of things to that trust in exchange for a promissory note. So no gift transaction, but all of the appreciation on those assets in excess of the interest rate accrue to the trust. If you still have extra money, and you have trusts that you've established in the past, or you don't mind paying a little bit of gift tax, get assets to your children, your grandchildren. Let them use their $14 million exemption. It's probably a little bit outside of the scope of this presentation, but if you have a non-GST exempt trust, there's ways that your children could apply their GST exemption to portions of that trust, while it remains a grantor trust to you during your life, and then becomes grantor trust to them after you've passed away. So again, for 2 generations, you have these taxable assets growing tax-free inside of the trust.
So what I'm hearing for sort of the ultra high net worth, which really the wealth can just be astronomical. You are looking, first of all, to maximize all of the exemption amounts that you can find within your own family.
Right.
So it's not just the clients, it's not just the spouses, but you can actually look at grandparents, children, grandchildren, anybody who's got the 13.61 million to shield, the initial seed fund and that initial dollar by forming a very tax advantaged trust. And these trusts, might go by names like IDGTs, IDGTs, intentionally defective grantor trusts. You can play some income tax games with them. They are going to be, hopefully formed in jurisdictions where they can keep going forever, so that the application of each dollar of GST exemption can grow on a tax-free basis for basically forever, and form these like family banks for those families forever, the family trusts, the dynasty trusts.
And on that point, Anne, one of the things that we often see people do when they come to the firm and ask us to review existing estate planning documents is they'll have mandatory distributions to children or grandchildren at certain ages. And we almost always say, take that out, because it forces assets that are in tax-advantaged, creditor remote vehicles into people's hands where they're going to be subject to taxes in the future. If it happens that your descendant happens to need $2 million at age 35, the trustee can distribute that, but don't force them to do something that might not be appropriate.
Yeah, I love that. And this can be, a different episode, because at wealth.com, we of course have our own forms, and we actually, push comes to shove, we prefer withdrawal rights over forced interim distributions. I think it's a very old school way of thinking about, don't keep things in trust forever because my kids may want, to go to college or grad school at 25 and then get married at 30 and then have their first kids by 35. So I want to have these interim distributions just to make sure that they can access the money. And it's actually, access can be achieved in all sorts of other ways. So these dynasty trusts, for example, they keep assets not only for the life of the beneficiary in trust, but actually for the life of the grandchildren in trust and great-grandchildren, etc. And people get comfortable with the dynasty trust model because you put in place flexible distribution standards and other, techniques like powers of appointment, etc., but that at least meet the tax code for, how to keep these assets from ever ending up back in the taxable estates of the beneficiaries. Another important point is actually about asset protection too. By forcing these distributions, and people forget to make the distributions. Let's be honest, like every 5 years when the kid hits their birthday, the trustees are not necessarily writing a check right away, right? But then you bet that if there's a divorce, or if there is, some sort of like a hit and run, and there's a creditor coming after your child, they're going to discover that there was a forced distribution mechanism, and they can reach those assets now inside the trust. So certain things to think about there. But Chris, I had another question for you, which is, what if you have, and maybe this is outside the scope, but are there then techniques that you would recommend to the people who are in that middle section, the middle category, the 10 million to 28, 30 million of transferable assets?
Sure. And these are the people that are obviously extraordinarily successful, very fortunate, but you feel bad for in this particular scheme, because again, if you have that 10 million, you're almost going to feel comfortable giving away nothing. If you have significantly more than 30, you can probably find the assets. but it's this period where maybe you don't want to do it, maybe it's a stretch. And so again, coming back to my first point, figure out really what you need to be comfortable. Make sure that you're okay. After that, make sure one spouse uses up his or her exemption amount first. And then the other thing you can consider doing is using promissory notes, right? So in most jurisdictions, the gift of a promissory note isn't enforceable, but there's ways to make gifts of enforceable promissory notes. The first is make sure it's valid under Pennsylvania law, which is sometimes a bit tricky. And the second is you can form an LLC and contribute the promissory note to the LLC in exchange for LLC interests. And the reason that works is because you've received something in return. It's no longer a gratuitous promissory note. It's a capital contribution in exchange for LLC interests. You can then donate the LLC to a trust, and you've made a gift of the value of the promissory note. The rub there is that you have to make sure to pay off the promissory note at least 18 months before your death. Because if you don't get credit for that gift. But if you have paid it off, then you've managed to extend the amount of time that you have to use your exemption. So again, $14 million note, the stroke before midnight on December 25th. Now you owe your trust $14 million. And you have until shortly before you pass away to rustle up the assets and pay it. If you paid it, you've transferred assets out of your estate, things are fine. If you don't pay it, well, then your exemption amount is decreased. The promissory note and the assets are includable in your estate, but you're in the same position you would have been had you not made the gift to start with.
Right. A couple of questions about this. So first, you mentioned, ideally you would prioritize one spouse giving away, more than 7 million to be able to use or make use of this doubled exemption. What do you do about clients where, it's possible for one spouse, for dissolution of the marriage, separation, etc.? What are some of the considerations that go into making this choice?
And just curious what downsides come with it.
Sure. So, the downsides are that one person has no exemption left, and so his or her estate is going to be subject to significantly more estate taxes, and the other person still has his or her complete remaining exemption. Oftentimes in couples, there's one spouse who has significantly higher earning potential, significantly more assets, and one spouse who has less of that. To the extent that the poorer spouse is comfortable with it, he or she can use all of her exemption and leave the exemption for the other spouse. But it's really a family decision to decide between the two of them, who wants to give up the assets, who wants to give up the exemption amount. And if you're really contemplating divorce, this is obviously not a great plan.
Does it also matter whether or not the two spouses have kind of different ideas about their beneficiaries, so that one set of beneficiaries can still take advantage of an exemption that's left to them at death versus the others are kind of, how is that at all a consideration?
Yeah, this wouldn't be tremendously appropriate in a second marriage situation where both spouses have children from the prior marriage, unless they were willing to create a big trust or two trusts, one for each set of children. This really works best in a situation where happily married couple, one set of children, and everyone agrees these are the people who are going to benefit.
Right. You've spoken a lot about promissory notes and this idea of selling assets, from like your trust and doing this kind of intra-family loan. Has that advice changed at all, given the fact that historically the rates now have risen since 2 years ago? And so what is the thinking there with using promissory notes now that the rates are closer to like 5% rather than like the bottom like 0.5% that it was 3 years ago?
Sure. So and as you know, the IRS sets the minimum required interest rate for promissory notes every month. 3 years ago it was close to 1%. These days it's much closer to 5%. The planning is a lot better when the rate's 1% than it is when it's 5%. But as long as you can get market returns that beat that amount, that hurdle rate, you're still benefiting the trust, right? If you're getting a 3% delta on assets you transfer in, that's fantastic.
I was just going to say, I want to throw another wrench in here and just think through this idea of like when you don't have kids. Because I think a lot of times we're talking about using the exemption, the planning around it, but I've actually been running into a lot of high net worth family, not families, just adults that they don't have any kids. And so it becomes this really hard choice of like their goal is to spend as much money as they possibly can down the line. And maybe they have nieces and nephews, they don't assume their parents would kind of be around and utilize trust for them. And so how does that play into choosing to use or not use the exemption?
Sure. So the estate tax, and I could clarify this slightly. The estate tax only applies to assets that you leave to people who aren't your U.S. citizen spouse. So if you're the sort of person who says, I'm going to spend everything, and to the extent I don't spend everything, it's all going to charity, there's not a lot for you here.
Yep.
As long as you're 100% sure your views aren't going to change in the future. If, again, you have nieces and nephews that you want to benefit, you can do that in a much more tax efficient way now by transferring assets to trust. I have a very wealthy client who, again, not married, no children, thinks he wants to leave everything to charity, but is set up, this trust for the benefit of extended family members and charities, and has also given a third-party protector the ability to add beneficiaries into the trust to provide a certain amount of flexibility. So, I think I want to benefit these people now. In the future, this third party can add other people, and maybe the trustee, would distribute more. If it's too much for them, the trustee would distribute the excess to charity.
So it's the techniques that we're talking about are still available, even if you don't have a spouse or kids. It's just that you have to be a little bit more clever, I think, about flexibility, because people who don't have spouse and kids just naturally, I think, don't have these like natural heirs, and so might change their minds, a little bit more often.
Yeah, giving flexibility to put people in, add people out. A lot of times, if people are setting up a trust, we'll still include my spouse as a beneficiary, even if there is no spouse, because on marriage, that person comes in.
And I think legally, as long as you have at least one beneficiary who is real and exists today, that's all you need, right? So you can actually have kind of this like straw man or somebody who stands in the shoes, as long as you have at least one real beneficiary, and then you can actually make placeholders who are potential beneficiaries in the future. That's interesting.
That's right. You have to think very careful about the laws of the state you're in, because it raises certain, fiduciary issues if you have the trustee doing it. But with a proper third-party non-fiduciary protector, you can make a lot of changes.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it sounds like in this middle space, it's like such a personal choice, right? Like, how do you feel? What assets do you have? What age are you? Is this growing to be a lot? But I think the other side about this we don't talk about is, where we haven't talked about yet, is you don't have to use the whole exemption too, right? There's still a lot of people in this space where, let's say you're 15 million net worth and you're in your early 40s, maybe you're not comfortable using all of that exemption, but there still is a lot of power in getting money out of your estate at this young of an age, right? If you have 40 years of compounding, you're going to have a state tax issue, but you're worried about what future jobs look like or your equity or business ownership, you can still donate $1 million or a couple $1,000,000 and still have a huge benefit of that growth coming out of your estate.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The deadline becomes a lot less harsh. It's no longer December 31st, 2025, but it absolutely makes sense to get things out of your estate and let the value of that accrue to other people. You can certainly, if you're setting up a startup business and you're comfortable, put lots of interest in that into a trust. And so it goes in with almost no value. If it does very, very well, then you've managed to get a lot out outside of your estate. If it doesn't, no harm, no foul, because again, it wasn't worth much when you put it in.
I think that for this episode, we've come to, a place where we can kind of put a pin in it. I do know that we teased earlier, Chris, the topic for the next episode, which is about slats. And slats have become incredibly popular because when folks want to take advantage of this doubled exemption, but don't quite yet have the comfort level to be able to like fully just, gift it away, there's a way to sort of have this back door through your spouse to still have some access to those assets. And so they have become, these slats have become really, really popular, almost to the point where it feels like they're being sold like products, out to people. And so we'll talk about that in the next episode. But also, I wanted to tease the fact that lately, I think on social media, in the financial advisor space, there's been a lot of chatter about a copyrighted trust. And the name is incredibly long, so I'm going to pull it up just so that we can have it in front of us. But to be honest, every single one of these words describes any irrevocable non-grantor trust I've ever formed. So I'm not sure what the value of these words are, but it is called the Copyrighted Non-Grantor Irrevocable Complex Discretionary Spendthrift Trust. We have asked Chris for his opinion, and he will share it with us in the next episode if you would like to tune in.